So first of all, Mu'adim Simcha. I hope everyone had a wonderful seder last night, and looking forward to having some enjoyable time in Pesach during Chol Moed. So today, I can't quite yet figure out whether what I was hoping to talk about will be related to Pesach exactly, but it, in a broader sense, in my mind at least, maybe there's a connection. But basically, I think it's interesting, both because of recent political events and also just as a more general discussion, to consider the question of what it means to serve other gods than HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and what are the different ways that people sometimes get engaged in doing that? Like, what are the reasons that they have? And I think part of the reason that it's helpful to identify those reasons carefully is because sometimes people don't want to advertise that they're serving the gods that they're serving. And then it can be a very kind of difficult discussion to drill down to the bottom and figure out that that's what's going on, especially in this day and age. And so if that's the case, then it's good to kind of have a bit of a sense of how we understand in the Torah what it means to serve other gods. And so I'm not sure we're going to entirely land on the punchline of that part of the discussion today. Maybe this will be more than one shiur. But I think the beginning point of that, or one way of getting into the subject, is to think a little bit about how there are many ways in our tradition that, especially when you look at this through the teachings of Chazal, like the sages of the Talmud, there's a resistance to different kinds of, let's say, well, they are kinds of dualism, but I don't want to make that point initially. I mean, resistance to different kinds of separation of two different things that seem like they could be distinct, but where the Torah wants to kind of unify them and say, no, there's only one thing here, really. So a few different examples, which we won't dwell on, but which I think are related to this point. You see all over the place a tendency for both Chazal and also, I think, looking at sources in Tanakh, for there to be this resistance to the idea that there's a difference between laws governing nature and laws that are given by Hashem to people that more are what you think of as laws involving justice or morality. You see that in Tehillim, where there are these passages, like in things we read in Psukei de Zimra, where there's this very kind of easy pivot from talking about things that sound more sort of like steam and ice and meteorology or whatever, to suddenly saying, and Hashem gave laws to Yaakov, and that suddenly it's about the Torah, seemingly. And then also, that same idea comes up in Chazal, where there's this notion of, in the same way, so to speak, that Am Yisrael keep the Torah, that also a rock should obey the command of Hashem and give water if he says so. That there's this desire to not allow us to imagine that there's this clear distinction between following laws of nature as a piece of nature that have nothing to do seemingly with morality, but are just like being a rock or doing something unnatural by giving water from a rock, whatever, all the different kinds of natural and unnatural things that you get from the tradition, versus these things that sound more like conscious choice about morality and justice, whether you're going to keep this law in the Torah that says you should do this or shouldn't do that, that you might have imagined those were separate categories of things. And in, I would say, both Tanakh and in the teachings of the sages, there's this desire to kind of blur that distinction and pose the question, can you really separate them, or maybe is there really one thing that we're talking about? And on a separate note, I think you could also say that there are other distinctions that are equally resisted. So another one that I would argue for, again, from sources we won't dive into deeply right now, is about the separation of the spirit and the body, right? That the idea, which again, when you state it that way, it sounds like, oh yeah, of course, everyone knows about how like there's the idea of a spirit or a soul, and then there's the body, there's the corporeal and the spiritual. They're not the same thing, and of course, you can sort of take one away from the other and sort of treat them on their separate barrels. But then I would argue you can find places in Tanakh that seem to really be, opposed to this idea, but maybe we would have to pull that out of the text more. But certainly, in Chazal and the sages, I think we've talked before about a source where, when discussing how Hashem wants to judge us, that He will take our soul and put it in our body, so to speak, and judge us body and soul together. There's this allegory of the blind man and the lame man stealing fruit from the king's garden together and all of that. So there's this notion that there is no kind of whole thing to be judged without body and soul together, and you really shouldn't be trying to separate them and sort of think about their value or merits, each on their own barrel. And so I would say that's another example of something in our tradition where we might have imagined you could separate things, but we're being taught that we really shouldn't think in those terms. And both of those, I would say, are examples maybe of the insistence of Torah, the insistence of our sages on the unity of Hashem, and the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is one, and because He's one, we don't get to play this game of breaking the world into lots of separate pieces that are sort of like distinct powers that function and have value on their own, especially in these matters that are maybe most central or most important to our relationship to Him, right? Such as keeping His laws and living in a world of nature that He created that seems to have laws that He ordained, or such as having a body and having some kind of holistic breath that animates the body as a whole, and the question of whether you really can kind of take those things, separately and evaluate them separately or not. Those are things that are maybe so important to our relationship with Him that they reflect His unity, and you can't really, separate them and divide them in two, the same way you can't divide Him in two. So those are side examples. But the thing I wanted to bring up today that's kind of like that is a particularly interesting distinction for the present day, which is, let's say, the distinction between the ritual and the practical. So what do I mean by that? Well, in principle, it seems like there are things that you might say that we do according to the Torah, where the reason that we're doing them is because they have some kind of symbolic meaning that fits into a framework of all these different signs and symbols that we're creating. For example, taking meaning like the 4 species on Sukkot. We take these 4 different kinds of plants, we bundle them together, we shake them in a certain way. It's not something anyone else in the world does besides Am Yisrael, because it seems not to have a generally apparent function that it accomplishes in the manner of a match lighting a fire or something. And so you're doing it because of its symbolic value. Some people would say because of its quote unquote spiritual value. And, I don't want to get into today whether there's any sort of spiritual value of things beyond what you would call their symbolic value. Separate discussion. But leaving aside the sort of slippery slopes into mysticism that abound when we start that kind of discussion, I think the basic point is that maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone would say that waving those 4 species of plants bundled together in a particular way has an obvious practical impact. But you're doing it because it's mitzvah and it's part of the Torah, and the Torah is teaching you about ways of relating to Hashem that partly involve the signage that you create, the symbolic structure that you participate in. So there's that, right? And then there are other things that we do that are like, eating, right? We're hungry, and if we don't eat at all forever, then eventually we're not going to survive. Um, that's the usual way of the world. We need to eat, we need to drink, we need shelter, we need to warm ourselves when it's cold, we need to cool ourselves when it's hot, all those kinds of things, and those are very basic practical needs, and they're very universal to the human condition, and very rooted in the sort of physicality of the world we inhabit. And there are lots of things you can do to deal with those aspects of living and existing that seem like they don't have anything to do with worship or with relationship to a Kadosh Baruch Hu per se, because lots of other people do them without ever imagining that they have anything to do with that, right? Like people eat, all people eat. And most people, when they eat, are not necessarily thinking that their eating has something to do with their relationship with Hashem. Or let's say, maybe most might be, an overstatement, but certainly many, or a plurality of people would fit that description. And maybe you could argue there's even a third thing in between, which is kind of like the not exactly totally practical, but the still kind of social as opposed to ritual, meaning people might also like to say there are things that they don't see them as being rituals exactly, but they're more like conventions that people share of signage and of communication that allow people to coordinate their action. So like money, for example, at one level is a symbolic structure that you're a part of, right? Paper money has no value except because of, a shared acceptance of certain signage or symbolic meaning that a bunch of people participate in, and that's what allows people to let information flow or be communicated through a market, through the exchange of these little pieces of paper, or more frequently digital transactions and bits on a computer. But the point is that relatively few people who use money think they're participating in something that would be called a ritual, and they'd say, well, this is just it's useful. There's kind of a chokhmah, there's a wisdom to participating in certain kinds of systems of communication, and really money is just a form of communication. But waving the four species in the air, that's not a practical wisdom of communication to coordinate people socially. You're doing something that's supposed to involve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and relate to him, and it's kind of elevating your gaze somehow above the practical need, either that you're accomplishing with communication, or some more basic physical practical need that's being served by lighting a fire or eating a sandwich or whatever. So that is a set of distinctions. Maybe it's three different things, maybe it's two things, but in any case, I would want to argue that one of the things that the Torah is teaching us is, again, perhaps because of the importance of this thing that we're talking about to our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the same way we can't split him into more than one piece, and he's one, and that is the central creed of Avodat Hashem as described in the Torah. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? That Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That if that's our starting point, then we're going to find it actually difficult in the framework of Torah to make separation, full, complete separation between what we would call ritual activities, what we would call practically useful symbolic activities, what we would call fully practical physical activities that have no symbolic meaning or significance. And there's basic observations you can make about how the tradition accomplishes this. Maybe the most obvious one is the brachot that we say, the blessings that the Torah obligates us to say, when we, for example, eat something, right? So I mentioned eating as an example of the most universal, basic, practical thing that you can do, where everyone needs to eat, and animals eat even. So even creatures that resemble people only in certain respects, one of the ways in which they do resemble people and vice versa is that we all eat. And certainly animals are not letting eating become part of some basis of their relationship with their creator in any conscious way. But when we eat, when Ovdei Hashem eat, when people trying to keep the Torah eat, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to say a bracha that looks at what we're eating and classifies it, and both invokes the idea with speech that this is somehow forming part of the basis of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and doing so in a way that's specific to the type of food that we're eating, whether it's a grain or a fruit of a tree or a potato that grew in the ground or whatever. And then also after you eat, you say another bracha that is more about acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu's role in supporting and sustaining us, and thanking him for the bounty that he's provided and all of that. So food is a very clear example where we take something that could have seemed to have stood separately in this category of practical activities, and the halacha, the requirements of Jewish law, basically takes something that seems like maybe it could stand on its own and says, no, let's tangle this up in relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that precisely these moments that seem most practical and unritual, we always have a ritual there that is part and parcel to it, so that at the end of the day, if everything is going according to plan, there's no daylight between the practical aspect of eating, which is you're hungry and you need to eat, and the ritual aspect of eating, which is that you make a bracha before and afterwards, that through speech establishes a context for that eating that is part of your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right, so that's probably the most famous example, and lots of other brachot, lots of other blessings that inject that same kind of possibility of relationship into other contexts, many of them equally mundane. And I think that maybe you could stop making, by just making the point there. I happen to have been studying a really fascinating source in Rambam's Mishneh Torah about another mitzvah in the Torah where I feel like it's an especially pungent example of how the Torah does this, though, in a way that is focused a little bit more on like maybe the middle case I mentioned, this kind of social construction, communication, choice kind of issue, because way over at the other end, you could say, okay, there are some things that we're only doing because they have ritual significance, like I mentioned before, where you're waving these plants in the air and it doesn't seem to do anything other than have a ritual significance. But I think that in between, as we mentioned, there are a bunch of things that people do that are not fully practical in the sense of you're sort of this isolated individual social atom of a single person who just isn't going to be able to survive unless they eat. And you are negotiating and navigating your interactions with other people. But there's a question of whether this is something that is kind of a wisdom of how to run a society that has kind of practical value in just keeping the society functioning, or whether it has a ritual significance. And so I'll just mention one thing that's like that. I mean, you could rattle off a list of things that are like that, like a law against stealing and the need for a court system to punish someone if they steal because it's against the law, or the fact that you have taxation or divorce or whatever else. There are lots of things people do where there's social conventions that they share. And some people would want to say, oh, well, those don't have ritual significance. Those aren't about connecting you with some, divine creator. It's just a set of shared rules that allow societies to flourish, and there's a kind of practical logic to them, and they're just useful, or maybe even they have some kind of more stripped down ethical aspect to them, but they don't have any notion of lifting your eyes again to that which is heavenly or what have you. But when I want to look at specifically, because I think it's very interesting how the sages take this mitzvah and turn it so much into something that seems different than how it first sounds. And that's the mitzvah of the ben sorer or more. So the idea of the mitzvah of the ben sorer or more is that you have a son who is rebellious, and he's not listening to the voice of his mother and father. So we can read the pasuk in Sefer Dvarim. Ki hiye leish ben sorer or more, הננו שומע בקול אביו ובקול אמו, ויסרו אותו, לא ישמע עליהם. So if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not listen to them, ותפסו בו אביו ואמו, והוציאו אותו אל זקני עירו, ve'el sha'ar miklomo. So the father and his mother lay hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city, to the gate of his place. And they go on to say he's a glutton and a drunkard. So so he's a glutton and a drunkard. They're telling Urgamuhu kol anshe iro ba'avanim v'met ובערת הרע מקרבך וכל ישראל ישמעו ויראו. And all the men of the city shall stone him with stones, that he die. So shall you put evil away from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So that is seemingly perhaps a mitzvah, a commandment that is serving some kind of practical social function. Now, it's obviously, on the one hand, not necessarily something people are used to seeing in the present day. And in fact, as we're about to see, it wasn't really ever possible to implement this law, even in a time when all the, court systems and whatever else were in place to allow the Torah law to be carried out. But at the level of what kind of impact a law like this is trying to have, it seems like a law having to do with relationships between parent and child, and how a society is supposed to establish norms for behavior, and that if someone is rebellious, then maybe the whole society would unravel if there's too much rebellion of child against parent, and so you have to create a law like this, what have you. The point is that you might have imagined someone creating a plan for a society that is supposed to flourish, and they would, for a practical reason, have some kind of rule like this, and they would say that we're doing this because it has a practical function in terms of the stability of the society, not because it has some kind of magical, or not because it has some kind of spiritual, or not because it has some kind of ritual function, where the meaning, or the part of the symbolic structure that it participates in, reaches for the heavens, so to speak, and elevates us and lifts us out of our practical situation. But it's more just that maybe, if you want your society to be stably founded, then there needs to be respect for the elders, and so you're going to do this. It doesn't automatically involve the idea, seemingly, of a relationship to Hakadosh Baruch Hu, other than the fact that obviously in the context of the Torah, all the mitzvot are coming from him. And so all mitzvot become part of that relationship. But what's so interesting is that if you now start looking at what this mitzvah has as requirements for its implementation, as described in Torah Shebal Peh, in the oral law. So you read about this in Mishneh Torah by the Rambam. You read about this in Rambam's text, in which he tries to take all the different things that we learned from the sages in the Talmud and codify them into a practical code of halacha. It's just amazing, because it's a fascinating mitzvah to study, because it's almost comical in how intricate the requirements are for how you would determine whether or not a son could be actually liable to be punished in the way described by this mitzvah in the Torah. So, in order to get through this rapidly enough, I'm not going to read through the Hebrew. I'm going to skim over the English. But so, or at least I'll read selected excerpts from the English after first trying to summarize. So there are many things in the wording of this law that the sages take to produce very explicit, specific criteria that have to be met. So, for example, the definitions of sorer or more, like that he's and soveh, that he's a glutton, a drunkard, all of this has to do, it turns out, with a specific meal that he has to have eaten. So it's not just anyone's judgment. He might be a glutton or a drunkard. It's like, what is the definition of that in halacha? And we learn, so he is not liable for stoning until he steals from his father and buys meat and wine at a cheap price. He must then eat it outside his father's domain, together with a group that are all empty and base people. And he must eat meat that is raw, but not entirely raw, and cooked, but not entirely cooked, as is the practice of thieves. He must drink the wine as it is thinned or diluted, as alcoholics drink, and he must eat a quantity of meat weighing 50 dinarim, which is estimated here to be 200 or 300 grams, in one sitting, and drink half a log, which is a quantity of liquid, of this wine at one time. So that's a first tranche of requirements. We haven't actually fulfilled all the requirements yet. But the point is, you can't just say, well, I feel like my son's a glutton because he had an extra bowl of oatmeal with breakfast this morning. There are a whole bunch of very specific requirements that we just heard that Chazal have taught us and that Rambam is relaying here. And I mean, the level of detail of a particular, it has to be a certain meal. It has to be wine and meat, meaning like beef or, mutton or whatever. And it has to be cooked a certain way. Can't be too raw, it can't be too cooked. The wine has to be diluted. You have to eat certain quantities of it. The wine and the meat have to be bought with stolen money that was stolen from the father by the son. And then, there's just like layer upon layer of more requirements of this. So, for example, because the parents say that he doesn't heed their voice, we heard that in the original reading of the mitzvah, it can't be that he's not heeding other voices, so he can't be committing a violation of the Torah at the same time in this meal. So, for example, if the meal is in any way not kasher, strangely, because there's an additional violation in the meal, then he's not actually fulfilling the requirement. So it has to be a kosher meal of this stolen meat. However, also he can't be fulfilling a mitzvah because then he is, heeding the voice of someone else, and it isn't comporting with the statement that he's simply not heeding the voice of his parents. So if, for example, he stole the meat and the wine and all of that, but he was, in order to throw a simcha for his base and empty friends' son's brit milah or something like that, that also would be a problem. So if it's somehow a seudat mitzvah or some kind of thing, where there's some other purpose served by the meal, that's also a problem. So the meal has to have, in a sense, a unique purpose of being the mitzvah meal of getting stoned by my parents or getting, convicted of needing to be stoned by my parents, and have no other purpose, and it has to be kasher. And then, we just move on to further and further, and I'm not going to get through all of these, but like, for example, this wayward and rebellious son, he's still a son, but he has to be chayav in mitzvot. He has to be obligated in mitzvot, which means he has to be a bar mitzvah. But if he has reached full adult maturity, which in the criteria laid out by Chazal, it seems have to do with basically like physical, sexual maturity, then he isn't liable either, right? If he's an adult, he can't be liable. So he has to be a bar mitzvah, but not yet fully mature, which means that there's actually a narrow window of time in which one can even potentially be a candidate for this punishment. Because if you are too old, then you're out. And if you're too young, then you're out. The further requirements, like we can't even necessarily get through all of them, but I'll just mention as the last few that I mentioned. You have to do this whole thing twice, because if you're not listening, then it means you have to have been warned after doing it once. So the idea is this 13-and-a-half-year-old or whatever it is steals money from his father and then uses it to buy certain kinds of meat and wine, which are then prepared in the exact proper way. And it's a kosher meal that isn't used for some other mitzvah purpose. And there are witnesses. And he is brought before a court and convicted of having done that, so that he can then be told, don't do it again. And then in that same narrow window of time, he steals more money from his father and does the whole thing over again with the meat, not too raw and not too cooked, et cetera, et cetera. Then finally, he can be convicted by a court of 23 judges and stoned. So it becomes a sort of almost a farce, the idea that this could ever be carried out. Like, it would take great determination on the part of the parents and the son to just work really hard as like a crack operation to actually get this to proceed. And they probably would, miss some detail and end up having the case thrown out. Like, it more or less is an extremely difficult way to commit suicide that you'd have to work on, with determination in order to actually succeed. So it's not really likely to, be something that you'd ever see carried out. But what fascinates me about all of this, thinking now about how we started off this whole discussion, is if you didn't start off with the mitzvah in the Torah and thinking of it in terms of, okay, this is some kind of law about, kids have to respect their parents, and maybe that somehow there's like a wisdom to how that supports the functioning and flourishing of society. And I described it to you instead, and I said, okay, there's this way where people are going to, in a very specific manner, kill another person, but only after that person has a very specifically prepared kind of meal that has to be acquired in a certain way and prepared in a certain way, and it has to consist of certain items, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it only can happen in this narrow window of time. He has to be at a perfect age. It starts to almost sound in this bizarre way, I mean, very anthropologically speaking, like in a totally different context, if that were described to you, you would say, this sounds like some strange ritual of human sacrifice, where someone went and studied the practices of some tribe in Papua New Guinea and discovered that there is this thing that they do with their 13-year-olds where occasionally they perform, the following activities, and one who is selected, for this purpose can be stoned to death or what have you after he eats this very specially prepared ritual meal, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying this is a mitzvah of sacrifice, because the definition of a korban, of a sacrifice in the context of Torah, has a very specific set of requirements, many of which are not met here. The Kohanim are not doing this, for example. It doesn't happen in the Mikdash, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, chas v'chalila, I'm not saying that this is, an instance of what you'd call human sacrifice in the Torah, but it's more that I'm saying, when you look at the requirements of the halakha, it is so laden with specificity, arbitrary specificity, that we usually more often associate with ritual, that it's an example par excellence of how the practical, or even the sort of socially practical, is not separable in the Torah from the idea of that which we do because it's like this pageant that we're acting out, so that we can establish with it a certain relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And really, I think there's more than one mitzvah like this in the Torah. So another one, for example, is Eglah Erufa. Eglah Erufa is another mitzvah that in some ways looks like a kind of a sacrifice. So this is the one where a dead body is found out in the wilderness in between two cities, and you measure which city is closest to, and then the Kohanim and the judges come, and you do the strange thing where you take a female calf that has not yet pulled a yoke, and you either break its neck or decapitate it and throw it into a Nachal Eitan, which is like a deep ravine with flowing water. And so there are aspects of this where now we even have Kohanim there, who are priests, who are killing an animal and throwing it into this gaping maw in the earth. And it looks almost like an animal sacrifice performed in a chthonic way, right? Like that if you're analyzing rituals of sacrifice that people do when they sort of throw their sacrifice into the earth or bury it in the earth, it's called chthonic sacrifice. And we don't have that because we don't do that in the Mikdash. And this isn't a sacrifice, but it is a ritual killing of an animal that doesn't seemingly have a practical impact on what you're supposed to do with the mystery of where the dead body came from, right? It's not turning into an episode of a crime scene, murder mystery show where they try to figure out more things about how this happened. They're doing something that looks much more like animal sacrifice, but not in the Mikdash. And it's again kind of pushing you off balance a little bit with saying you seem to have come across a more practical situation of, oh, okay, there's a body here. Where did it come from? Is there some justice to be done? And indeed, the judges are there. The shoftim come for the mitzvah of the egla ofa. But there are aspects of this that seem actually to be more about doing something similar to what we're doing with the Ben Sorer Moreh, which is to kind of expel Ra, whatever Ra is, sometimes translated as evil, from the midst of the people by doing something that has a much more ritual aspect to it. And I really think this is actually a deep theme in the Torah that really starts going all the way back to maybe Gan Eden, but I'll say to Noach, where Noach is being told by HaKadosh Baruch Hu that there's going to be a flood, and he has to build a teva. And the question is the teva a piece of technology, or is the teva more like a mikdash? Is it like an act of avodah? Is it an act of worship or service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Because on the one hand, if there's going to be a flood, it seems like a boat is a useful piece of technology to have to survive the flood. On the other hand, there's something almost ludicrous about how the teva is described when you actually think about what it would mean to try to survive a flood, to cram a bunch of animals into a boat of the dimensions that are described. It doesn't sound like something that would really be the most rational plan for how to survive. And the text even kind of hints at this, because when Noach is being given instruction for how to caulk the hull of the boat, the word that's used for kofer, which is like the caulking of the hull, is v'chafarta, that you should caulk the hull with pitch or whatever. But the word the chafarta, right? So the vav, chaf, fe, resh, taf. Interestingly, that set of letters exactly, the rearrangements of that letter spell kaftor, parochet, and kaporet, all three of which are words used in describing the construction of what? Of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, right? So when eventually Bnei Israel are being told how to build this seemingly purely ritual structure, where the sacrifices are going to be performed on Har-Bayit or in the desert or wherever the Mishkan is, you're given a lot of instructions about how to build something, and you talk about buttons, and kaftor, or clasps, or whatever you want to call them. You talk about parochet and kaporet, these different kind of covers or screens that are part of it. And we don't think of the Mishkan as a piece of technology. Same way, maybe we incline to think of the Teva as mainly as a piece of technology. And what that linkage is doing is saying, well, maybe the Teva is like a Mikdash, maybe it's like a Mishkan, maybe it's actually something that Noach is doing as avodah, as sort of a service to Hashem, who's giving him instruction. And on the other hand, he goes back over to the Mishkan, and you're saying, is this just, quote unquote, a ritual structure, or is it a piece of technology? Does it have a practical purpose? Is it going to have an impact in the world that's more practical than I realize, right? Now that I've sort of established it and built it, what's going to happen there? And what are going to be all the sort of practical implications of having this, farm to table restaurant, agricultural festival, with music and incense and arts and crafts on this one mountain in Yerushalayim, and having that all bound up in people's different ritual moments, navigating their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and with each other. So there's a lot, I think, sprinkled throughout the Torah from end to end, where you can say, I'm not sure I should be just thinking this is quote unquote just a ritual, or this is quote unquote just a bit of practical advice, or something in between, a social structure that promotes flourishing, that has symbolic aspects, but is still just about getting people to do things that are sensible together. The same way we don't want to pry apart the soul and the body, or we don't want to pry apart the idea of following the law of nature or following Hashem's command of a more sort of moral or ethical kind. We don't want to try to break Hashem into pieces that says, like, this is the ritual part and this is the practical part. And we see that over and over and over again in the text of the Torah and in these different laws. I think the Ben Sorer Moreh is a particularly fascinating one, just because the details are so vivid and almost comical when you try to imagine how someone could actually, ever accomplish this mitzvah. And because it seems like it would be hard to do right, even if you were trying with all your might to get it right, because of how detailed and precise the different components of quote unquote the ritual of this meal that has to happen twice are in order to get everything to be ready for launch.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.